In today's lesson, we are going to read an article together. We will look at some of the more advanced vocabulary and the more advanced grammatical constructions. We'll talk about why they have been used and what effect that has on the text. We will also look at the pronunciation of some of the trickier words that we find along the way. After we've finished analysing the text, we will then go back to the beginning and I will read it from the beginning until the end. You can use this as your opportunity to practice listening or speaking. So you can read along with me and try and mimic my pronunciation and intonation. If that sounds good to you, let's take a look at today's article. Here is today's article. It's quite a difficult one. We'll see lots of advanced vocabulary here, also some interesting grammatical structures. So this article is from One Stop English, okay? So this is a website that you can use for English learning materials. And the name of this article is Why Accent Bias is a Dirty Game. Now, many of you know some features of British and American English. In American English, they tend to use what we call the T flap. So dirty in British English will become dirty in American English. The T sound often sounds more like a D. And a dirty game, we'll see why they've said dirty in a minute, but a dirty game is an unfair game. If somebody plays dirty, they don't play fairly. And we will look at this in more detail in the text. You also may not know that the word bias is a synonym for a prejudice, a prejudgment. When somebody makes a judgment about somebody else, in this case, it's accent bias, okay? So we can have biases for many different reasons. In this case, it's thinking about you, making a judgment about you because of the accent that you have, okay? So accent bias is a prejudgment, a prejudice, in this case, based on your accent. Now, I will ask you a little bit about this at the end of the lesson too. You can tell me if you've ever faced some sort of prejudice or bias because of the way that you speak, whether that be in your native language or in English. Prince Harry may have adopted a transatlantic twang. We all know who Prince Harry is, okay? And we have some interesting points here. First of all, we've got the verb to adopt, which is to take on or to start using. And we've also got past modal construction, okay? So this is something that he has done, okay? So we accept that Prince Harry has taken on a particular type of accent, okay? And we'll look at that as well. A transatlantic twang, okay? So firstly, a twang is a particular way of speaking. More specifically, this is a quality of the human voice produced when air comes out of the nose, okay? So it's a quality of the human voice. Our next word we're going to look at is transatlantic, okay? And now we can see that this is made up of two parts, this word. We have trans, the prefix, which means across. Okay, so trans refers to across. And then we have Atlantic, which is referring to the Atlantic Ocean, across the Atlantic. Okay, across the Atlantic. When we talk about countries either side of the Atlantic, we are often talking about the UK and the United States. So a transatlantic accent or a transatlantic twang refers to the way that somebody speaks when they have influences from both the UK, British English, and from American English. So Prince Harry may have adopted a transatlantic twang. So he's now speaking with a slightly more Americanized accent, but a posh voice still helps you get a top job. When we talk about a posh voice, we're usually talking about the accent that we associate with the royal family in the UK, this Queen's English or BBC English, as it's sometimes called. And a top job is the best jobs. So basically, we're saying here that, yeah, we can see that Prince Harry has changed his accent. He sounds a bit less posh, but the reality is that having a posh voice still helps you to get the best job. Kirstie Alley, the American actress and comedian who has died at the age of 71, was one of my first voice crushes. Kirstie Alley was a famous actress and comedian. Now here, the use of the present perfect suggests that at the time of this article was written in 2023. She had recently died, okay? So she died in December 2022. And this article was written probably at the beginning of 2023. So that's why the writer, Jo Ellison in this case, has decided to use the present perfect, because it was a very recent event. And we often use the present perfect with recent events. Now, she was one of my first voice crushes. A crush is when you like somebody very much, often in a romantic way, but it's just somebody who you admire very much. Now, a voice crush is when you admire somebody's voice a lot. Born in Wichita, Kansas in 1951, Alley looked like a real dame. All big hair and power shoulders. Okay, so she was probably at the height of her fame in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, when big hair, people had very big hairstyles. And many women and during that era wore shoulder pads. So they had these big, powerful looking shoulders. So that's what it's doing here. We're trying to create an image. If you don't know what Kirstie Alley looks like, go and have a look at her. And maybe you'll get an idea of what the writer is talking about here. And she had a voice to match. To match can be used as a verb or a noun, and this means when something goes well together. We often use it to talk about clothes. We can say that those trousers and that top, they don't match. So maybe choose something else. They don't look good together. She had a voice to match, a voice that matched her big hair and her power shoulders. It went well. You associated her voice with that. She had a big, powerful voice. With a cool Midwestern refers to the part of the United States, the Midwest. Swagger is a specific way of walking when you walk in a very confident way with your shoulders back and you just look really confident. And a throaty rasp. Throaty refers to the throat, so a lot of the sounds were produced in her throat. And a rasp is something that's a little rough. She had quite a distinctive, deep voice. If you can find some sort of extract of Kirstie Alley talking, you'll understand what the writer is saying. I've always had voice crushes. Okay, again, another use here of the present perfect. The present perfect because it's something that began in the past and is still continuing in the present. So I've always had voice crushes, but not for grand stentorian types. Stentorian is a very loud voice. I love voices that sound unusual or have a slightly broken crack. Okay, if you know what a crack is, it's some sort of fault or line in something. So the writer here likes these less than perfect voices, slightly broken. So what maybe we wouldn't consider to be a perfect voice, a grand stentorian voice. She likes voices with character that have something different about them. This year we have been robbed of. Okay, so here again, we've got the present perfect. But not only have we got the present perfect, we also have the passive. So somebody has stolen. Remember, you can steal something or to be robbed. We have had something stolen. Okay, somebody has taken something from us. Here we're talking in a literary sense. We've lost some wonderful actors and actresses of some especially fine examples. Fine in this case is referring to something particularly great, along with, together with, not only Alley, we lost. Note here how we use the past simple instead of we have lost. By using the past simple, this sounds much more final and finished, like we know that this person isn't going to come back. So that's an interesting choice there in terms of the tenses. The past simple always sounds more finished and final than the present perfect, which still has some connection to the present. We lost Robbie Coltrane, whose deliciously strong South Glaswegian brogue. A brogue is a particular type of speaking, often associated with Scottish or Irish accents, those very smooth, wonderful accents. So, and from Glasgow, Glaswegian refers to somebody who comes from Glasgow. Okay, so somebody who's from Glasgow might refer to themselves as a Glaswegian or they can be Glaswegian. So we can use it as a noun to describe a person from Glasgow, or we can use it as an adjective too. So his strong south, from the south of Glasgow accent, remained undimmed. Undimmed. To dim something means to make it less bright, okay, to make it fade a little. So, and here we've got the adjective form, dimmed, and then we've added the prefix un, which of course is the opposite. So his accent did not get any weaker. He kept his strong brogue, his strong accent throughout his acting career. He never stopped talking in his distinctive Glaswegian accent. Angela Lansbury, the London-born actress. Okay, here we've got a compound adjective, which means the actress who was born in London. I have mentioned this before. We often use compound adjectives in English to avoid relative clauses. In English, we're not fans of making really long, difficult to read sentences. And one way of doing that is to use compound adjectives. So we could have said the actress who was born in London and who moved to Hollywood and who spoke with a gorgeous, etc. So in one way of making that more compact and succinct is to say London born. She moved to Hollywood and spoke with a gorgeous, warbly, slightly mangled transatlantic poshness. Wow, lots of words there. So firstly, we have warbly. To warble is like to sing. So a slightly song-like accent. Slightly mangled. Okay, mangled is an interesting word here. Mangled is not usually a positive thing. It's something that is twisted and broken. Okay, so slightly mangled, a little bit broken. Transatlantic poshness. Okay, so again, there's that word trans, across the Atlantic. So what the writer here is conveying that she spoke with a transatlantic poshness, but it was far from perfect. And she sees that as a wonderful thing because she's used the adjective here, gorgeous, right? Something that is absolutely beautiful, amazing, something she really appreciates. And Queen Elizabeth II, one of the last public figures who actually spoke the Queen's English. A voice so plummy with class privilege, she could barely enunciate a vowel. Wow. Many of you will have heard how Queen Elizabeth spoke. And I would agree, this is probably the last time that we really saw that true Queen's English. The use here of the adjective plummy comes from the fact that some people think if you want to speak with an English accent, you need to pretend that you have a plum in your mouth to create that particular way of speaking. In this case, that's what she's referring to. It sounds like she had a plum in her mouth, and that is associated with class privilege. A privilege is something that you have, an advantage that you have because of a particular reason. So a lot of the times we associate it with class because if you are of a higher social class, you often have more advantages or more opportunities, shall we say, than somebody who comes from a lower class. She could barely enunciate. So she could barely, remember, barely means she almost couldn't. Okay. So if we look at she could barely, this would be the same as saying she almost couldn't say a vowel. She almost couldn't. All were in possession of. Okay, in possession of. They had. Okay, we could just simply say they had. If you use a noun instead of a verb in English, that is a way of sounding more formal. So we can just say all had fabulously distinctive voices. Okay, so distinctive is something that makes you different. And in this case, we've used the adverb fabulously, which comes from the adjective fabulous, wonderful. Remember to make adverbs in English, usually, not always, but most of the time, you'll take your adjective and you'll add ly. So these wonderfully different voices. They all represented a different social tribe. In this case, tribe refers to a different social group. In some ways, they represented the vestige of an era in which your voice truly announced your past. This is a very interesting sentence. A vestige is the last part of something significant in the past. Okay, so the way that they spoke represented a time in British history when the way that you spoke told people where you were from or what social background you were from. In the UK, one could be forgiven, Okay, instead of saying you could be forgiven, one could be forgiven. We don't say one could do something very much in our speech, but some people use it for literary effect. So it means you could be forgiven. It would be easy to understand for thinking that such accents, these accents, have now been eroded in the drift to glottal drawl. So the idea here is that these very distinctive or different accents are being eroded, have now been eroded. So again, we've got the present perfect in the passive form. So something has eroded this situation, has eliminated or slowly worn it away. Little by little, we see this less and less. We don't really mention what has caused this erosion of these accents. And maybe it doesn't matter, or it's too big of a topic to go into in one short article. The idea is in this globalization, in this movement, this drift, it's quite a literary way of saying this movement, to this glottal drawl. A drawl is a way of speaking where the vowels tend to get longer and the sounds of the words are probably less clear. Glottal drawl refers to sounds that are made here in the glottis. It's a dirty game, says Prince Harry. So this is where the title of this article comes from. Of course, dirty doesn't actually exist, but it's just phonetically how dirty is pronounced when pronounced in a transatlantic accent. Says Prince Harry in the second Netflix trailer to promote his tell-all documentary. Okay, here we have another compound adjective in his documentary where he told everything. Something that is tell-all is where somebody opens up and talks about every aspect of their life. His teas made carefully more matey. Okay, so one characteristic of what people consider to be a less posh accent is that the T's are not as enunciated, as pronounced as in the posh accent, if you like. So in the American accent, a T will become more of a D sound. You may have heard bottle becomes bottle in many British English accents. The word matey is the adjective that has come from the noun a mate, which in British and I think in Australian English is a synonym for a friend. It's an informal word for a friend. So you can say, I met my mates at the weekend. So he's trying to sound more matey, more friendly, more in touch with the average person. Lest we remember, he was born at the very zenith of the hierarchy he seems intent on bringing down. Lest is a very literary word. People don't tend to say lest in their daily lives. It means for fear that we do something. So it's a conjunction. Whatever you use after lest is what you don't want to happen, so that he doesn't want us to remember that he was born at the tip, at the most important part of the hierarchy. Remember, the hierarchy is a system where there is a very specific order or different layers of importance. Also, be careful with the pronunciation. It's a very difficult word to pronounce. Hierarchy. He seems intent on. If you are intent on doing something, you have the intention of doing that. Okay, now they haven't used he is intent on because we don't know. He obviously hasn't said that he wants to bring down the hierarchy or the royal family in the UK, but sometimes he gives that impression, right? That he doesn't like the system and he doesn't want that system to continue. That's what the impression that he gives. That's why we've used seems instead of is. Bringing down. To bring something down is to reduce its importance. But despite, remember, despite is a connector, which means not prevented by. So not prevented by the sludge of accents. A sludge of something is just a little bit of a mess, right? Or just a messy mix of accents. We now hear across the media. So we hear that throughout the media. This is interesting because in the past, it was very difficult to work for the media if you didn't speak the Queen's English, which is why it sometimes is known as BBC English, because in order to work for the BBC, you had to speak in a specific way. It transpires, or it turns out, it shows that they are still the source of powerful prejudices. Okay, the source of, the root of, where it comes from. Powerful. So the noun power in the adjective form becomes powerful. Prejudices, remember that's another word for bias or some sort of prejudgment that people may face as a result of something. But in this case, we're talking about accent prejudice that most must overcome. This means most people. Okay, most people have to overcome. Okay, so it's an obstacle in your way. And in order to get past this barrier, you must overcome it in some way. You must pass over this obstacle. In the incredibly depressing, okay, something that's going to make you feel really depressed and unhappy, BBC documentary, How to Crack the Glass Ceiling this week, the broadcaster Amal Rajan examined how accent bias still contributes hugely, in a huge way, in a big way, if unwittingly. So if something is done wittingly, it is done knowing that you are doing something. If you do it unwittingly, remember the prefix un is the opposite. So you do it without knowing. Okay, so people often face accent bias, sometimes without the intention of the other person. They don't mean to have this bias, to have this prejudice, but they do it unwittingly, without knowing. To our advancement, the noun of to advance, to go forward. In an employment market where our prospects are still determined, they're still decided by the way we sound, the way that we speak. Using studies by researchers at Queen Mary's Department of Linguistics, Rajan revealed that 70% of newsreaders across the UK's main news channels speak in received pronunciation. So that was what I was talking about. In the past, it was probably 100%. It's still 70%. Despite representing only 10% of a population in which 75% have accents he described as industrial working class. Received pronunciation is the accent that many people associate with the English accent, but in reality, it only represents 10% of the people who live there. 75%, so 3/4 of the people who live in the UK actually speak with these, what he calls industrial working class accents. So working class, of course, we associate with the class that historically has had to work for a living. You've got working, middle, and upper class in the UK. Some people say that class structure still exists. I think that's fair to say. Here, the use of the word industrial probably refers to working class accents that aren't rural. So you have the rural working class, people who work in the countryside or traditionally worked in farming, if you go back in history. So he's talking about the working class accents that are more associated with the cities, with industry. Moreover, remember that is a connector that means additionally, so adding another point. He offered further evidence, more evidence, that within the civil service, that's the government, the public sector, banking and legal sectors, people who sounded southern and metropolitan were far more likely to progress. By southern here, he's referring to people who come from or sound like they come from the south of England, typically. Okay, so in that southeastern area, typically, and metropolitan, so somebody who comes from a big city. Probably when he uses metropolitan, he's talking about London. The show's case studies made for a pitiful expose. Pitiful comes from the noun pity. It makes you feel sad or a bit depressed. So this is the adjective form of that. An expose is some sort of public report, often one that shows something shocking or secret. Made for, from the phrasal verb to make for, means to result in. So what this means is the show's case studies resulted in a depressing public report of the classism, not how I pronounce this word. So when you see this ism suffix, you can pronounce it in that way. Classism, racism, sexism. But here, this is some sort of discrimination, and here it's discrimination because of class, the classism that still exists in the UK. So we're saying that classism, while many people like to think it's a thing of the past, it's still there. It still happens. We still see it every day in the UK. Chris, born into poverty. So remember, poverty is the noun of poor, so somebody who doesn't have any money. Born into poverty, who was born to a poor family. in Hull was concerned that his northern accent made him sound stupid to employers. While Barrister Page, barrister is a type of lawyer in the UK, worried about getting a pupillage because she didn't sound the part. A pupillage is like a special apprenticeship, or when you're like a student still learning with a law firm, because she didn't sound the part. The idea being here that she didn't sound like she belonged. Okay, the part, maybe that comes from acting. The part is the role that you play. So she was worried that because of the way that she spoke, she didn't sound like a real barrister. None of the people interviewed spoke like the people before whom they sat. Okay, so the people who were interviewed, in this case, Paige and Chris, didn't speak in the same way as the people who were interviewing them before whom they sat. Okay, it's quite a formal structure here. We don't really use whom much when we speak anymore. And despite advice and leadership training, none got the jobs they seemingly deserved. This means that they seemed to deserve the job that they applied for, but perhaps because of the way that they spoke, they were not offered these positions. Even the extraordinarily sharp Seth, okay, sharp, it means clever, really bright, very ambitious, all the good things that you want, who hoped to become a journalist. Okay, look here at the structure, hope to become, hope to do something. Okay, with the infinitive. Concluded, so he came to that conclusion, that while he had a starred first degree, okay, so a first class degree is like the top degree, starred first, he was the perfect student, and the dean's prize for being brilliant, so the dean is like the head of the university. His rural Somerset accent would probably be deemed too local to break the world of prestige news. What it's saying here is that although Seth was perfect, the obstacle that he was facing was that his accent was considered to be too rural. He didn't sound metropolitan enough. Remember, we saw that earlier in this article. So the fact that he spoke in this non-metropolitan accent could have been, or perhaps was, the obstacle for him getting into the world that he wanted to get into, which was journalism, world-class journalism. The program, the TV program, was less about how to crack the class ceiling, a play on words with the glass ceiling, than whether it could actually be done. Okay, here whether means if. So if you could do it. Okay, so instead of saying if you could do it, we've used the passive. Can anyone do it? Could this be done? It's quite a difficult construction, that. Can this be done? If you can, if one can get through this class ceiling, this limit on you because of your class or your social background. Meanwhile, so at the same time, a bunch of people, so a lot of people, note the shift from formal to informal language here. A bunch of is a more informal construction. In black shoes and wacky socks, crazy socks. Okay, so they're wearing these shiny, perfect black formal shoes with crazy socks, who spoke like young conservatives. This is from the Conservative Party in the UK, typically associated with the upper and the middle class in British politics, described their corporate efforts to overcome class bias. Despite the inclusive rhetoric, okay, so this is a way of speaking designed to persuade people. So they're saying all the right things, right? They're saying, yes, we include people. We do all these wonderful things to make sure that the right person gets the job, regardless of the way that they speak. Class divisions, so people divided by their class, in the UK are still appallingly pronounced. It's a very strong word. Something that is appalling is horrific, terrible. So they are still terribly visible. Pronounced is like very, very visible. Okay, you can really see how bad the situation is. This is what the article is saying. Last month, it was reported. Note the use of the impersonal passive. So it was reported that only 21% of senior leadership positions in the city are held by staff from a working class background. So people who grew up in working class families. And that the UK has one of the poorest, there's a superlative. Okay, so it's a synonym of worst, one of the worst rates of social mobility in the developed world. What they mean by social mobility is the ability to move up Okay, so even if you're born into a poor family, the idea should be that you can move up and improve your prospects in the world. In the UK, we may have softened up our T's. Okay, so we're saying more bottle instead of bottle. So we made them softer, they're not so crisp. And toned down, so reduced how strong our outward poshness. Okay, so how posh we seem on the outside. Okay, outward is the opposite, of course, of inward. So how we are on the inside and how we seem on the outside. So many people don't want to seem as posh. But classism remains as pernicious as it was some 50 years ago. Pernicious means having a very harmful effect or influence. So classism is still as harmful, as dangerous as it was some 50 years ago. Voices can be a powerful weapon. Interesting here that voices have been compared to something as strong as a weapon. Sometimes they open doors, okay, metaphorical doors. They give you more opportunities. But it is incredibly sad to think that still in 2022, the way you speak determines the extent to which you can advance, you can go forward. I only experienced voice shame, so feeling embarrassed about my voice, while working in the south of Ireland early in my career, where I was uniquely conscious, I was very specifically aware that every time I spoke, my colleagues heard 400 years of colonial rule. If you don't know anything about Irish history, just be assured that they were treated pretty horrifically by the English. They were always very nice about it. They had the world's best accent too. Many people agree that the Irish accent is one of the best, if not the best accent in the world. But as a consequence, I played down my posher inclinations. If you play something down, you reduce it so that it is not as obvious. Okay, so he didn't want to sound as posh as maybe they thought he might be. Okay, to give myself a more artful dodger or white matey tone. The Artful Dodger is a character from Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, who grew up in the London slums. So he's from a very poor working class background, the poorest of the poor at that time. Along with square mile incentives to raise the number of people, to increase the number of people with working class backgrounds to elevated leadership roles, I hope the documentary prompts employers, okay, so triggers or encourages or gets employers to embrace, to accept a broader choir. So broader here means wider, so bigger, more inclusive. Choir. Choir is a group of singers. And in this case, he doesn't really mean a group of singers, but he means a group of voices. So to have people with different voices. The constipated tremolo. Tremolo is a musical term just to refer to the repetition of the same sound. The point here is that by hearing the same sound over and over again, it's strange, it's foreign, peculiar, and dissonant. Our diversity in voices makes the world a greater place. Why work with Harrys when you could have a Hagrid on the desk? In Harry Potter, Harry has a received pronunciation accent, while Hagrid has a West Country accent from the western part of England. He has a really distinctive, wonderful accent. Let's go back to the beginning and read the article from the beginning to the end. Remember, this is your opportunity to read along with me to practice your pronunciation and your intonation. Kirstie Alley, the American actress and comedian who has died at the age of 71, was one of my first voice crushes. Born in Wichita, Kansas in 1951, Alley looked like a real dame, all big hair and power shoulders, and she had a voice to match, with a cool Midwestern swagger and a throaty rasp. I've always had voice crushes, but not for grand stentorian types. I love voices that sound unusual or have a slightly broken crack. This year, we have been robbed of some especially fine examples. Along with Ali, we lost Robbie Coltrane, whose deliciously strong South Glaswegian brogue remained undimmed throughout his acting career. Angela Lansbury, the London-born actress who moved to Hollywood and spoke with her gorgeous, warbly, slightly mangled transatlantic poshness, and Queen Elizabeth II, one of the last public figures who actually spoke the Queen's English. A voice so plummy with class privilege, she could barely enunciate a vowel. All were in possession of fabulously distinctive voices, all represented a different social tribe. In some ways, they represented the vestige of an era in which your voice truly announced your past. In the UK, one could be forgiven for thinking that such accents have now been eroded in the drift to glottal drawl. It's a dirty game, says Prince Harry in the second Netflix trailer to promote his tell-all documentary. His tease, made carefully more matey, lest we remember he was born at the very zenith of the hierarchy he seems intent on bringing down. But despite the sludge of accents we now hear across the media, it transpires that they are still the source of powerful prejudices that most must overcome. In the incredibly depressing BBC documentary How to Crack the Class Ceiling this week, the broadcaster Amol Rajan examined how accent bias still contributes hugely, if unwittingly, to our advancement in an employment market where our prospects are still determined by the way we sound. Using studies by researchers at Queen Mary's Department of Linguistics, Rajan revealed that 70% of newsreaders across the UK's main news channels speak in received pronunciation, despite representing only 10% of a population in which 75% have accents he described as industrial working class. Moreover, he offered further evidence that within the civil service, banking and legal sectors, people who sounded southern and metropolitan were far more likely to progress. The show's case studies made for a pitiful expose of the classism that still exists in the UK. Chris, born into poverty in Hull, was concerned that his northern accent made him sound stupid to employers, while Barrister Paige worried about getting a pupillage because she didn't sound the part. None of the people interviewed spoke like the people before whom they sat. And despite advice and leadership training, none got the jobs they seemingly deserved. Even the extraordinarily sharp Seth, who hoped to become a journalist, concluded that while he had a starred first degree and the Dean's Prize for being brilliant, his rural Somerset accent would probably be deemed too local to break the world of prestige news. The programme was less about how to crack the class ceiling than whether it could actually be done. Meanwhile, a bunch of people in black shoes and wacky socks who sounded like non-conservatives described their corporate efforts to overcome class bias. Despite the inclusive rhetoric, class divisions in the UK are still appallingly pronounced. Last month, it was reported that only 21% of senior leadership positions in the city are held by staff from a working class background, and that the UK has one of the poorest rates of social mobility in the developed world. In the UK, we may have softened up our T's and toned down our outward poshness, but classism remains as pernicious as it was some 50 years ago. Voices can be a powerful weapon. Sometimes they open doors. But it's incredibly sad to think that still in 2022, the way you speak determines the extent to which you can advance. I only experienced voice shame while working in the south of Ireland early in my career, where I was uniquely conscious that every time I spoke, my colleagues heard 400 years of colonial rule. They were always very nice about it. They had the world's best accent too. But as a consequence, I played down my posher inclinations to give myself a more artful dodger or white matey tone. Along with new square mile incentives to raise the number of people with working class backgrounds to elevated leadership roles, I hope the documentary prompts employers to embrace a broader choir. The constipated tremolo we hear throughout the media sounds just as foreign, peculiar and dissonant as any local accent ever could. Our diversity in voices makes the world a greater place. Why work with Harrys when you could have a Hagrid on the desk? That's it for today's lesson, but just before you go, these are the discussion questions. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next lesson.